Hello, everyone. Welcome to Global Voices. For those of you who are not in the Beeson Divinity School community, you are very welcome here. Thanks so much for coming. It's great to see a turnout. I think we'll have a few more as well. This is a weekly event almost every week that we have during the semester. You're always invited. This semester has been a really good turnout for events, and the quality, I've just been really encouraged. And so just know that you're always welcome to come. Before we get started, I want to let you know that this event is kind of a two-part series. So next week, we have an orphan care forum where they will be discussing, I guess, as opposed to today, a lot of, hey, let's not do this. Next week, we'll be talking about what are best practices for orphan care. We will have Dr. Amanda Howard from our psychology department here. We'll have Garth Thorpe with Lifeline Children's Services and Johnny Grimes with Altar 84 and the Haiti Collective. Please register. Melanie, where is she? She's going to pass out a registration sign-up form, so please go ahead and sign up there. You can also sign up later online. We'll have that on social media. You can find it on our website. I'm excited about today. Let's go ahead and get started. I'd like to introduce our two special guests. First, Dr. Rick Morton. Raise your hand. Right there. He's father to 3 children adopted through intercountry adoption. He's dedicated to orphans, and it extends beyond just his family. He is co-author of Orphanology, Awakening to Gospel-Centered Adoption and Orphan Care, and author of No Orphans, Mobilizing the Church Through Global Orphanology. Rick and his wife are co-founders of International Orphan Hosting Ministry, Promise 139. It's based in Hattiesburg, Mississippi. Rick also serves as Vice President of Engagement for Lifeline Children's Services, an international ministry dedicated to caring for the fatherless. Previously, he spent many years serving as a seminary professor and local church pastor. As a friend and follower on social media, I can also tell you he is an avid Alabama fan. Have you noticed the little the houndstooth there? If you look closely, you can see some houndstooth. Dr. David Smolin is a special guest with us today. He is the Harwell G. Davis Professor of Constitutional Law and Director for the Center for Children, Law, and Ethics at the Cumberland School of Law at Samford University. He serves as an independent expert for the Hague Conference on Private International Law on intercountry adoption issues. And he serves as an external expert for the International Reference Center for the Rights of Children Deprived of Their Family, which is of the International Social Service on Adoption and Surrogacy Issues. He wisely gave me permission to only read the first few lines of his resume when it comes to international adoption because we eventually need to get started with this event today. All right. So I will start with a question, but before I do, I want to let you know you are welcome to ask questions during this event. During the main part, while I'm asking some of the questions, please keep your questions on topic, and then towards the end, you feel free, if we have time, to ask any questions that are on your mind. So first, let me start us off in prayer. Please pray with me. Lord Jesus, you taught us to care for the hurting and the vulnerable, and orphans represent the most vulnerable of any society. May you help us to have your heart for these children whom you love. May you help us to understand and care about the difficult truths of intercountry adoption, for you not only care about truth, you are truth. May you help those who are working with orphans globally be as wise as serpents and as innocent as doves. Help us today to understand the complexities of this issue so that your church can better glorify you in the world. So in Jesus' name I pray, amen. Okay, first question. What does the Bible say about adoption and orphans?
Wow.
You want me to go first?
Sure, it doesn't, you can feel free.
Okay. So, by the way, I have on my BE Press site, if you just Google Smolin BE Press, a long article about that question. Okay, so I won't have time to cover it all, but they're free. Just download it.
I can say I've read it. It's excellent. I would highly recommend it.
Okay. So, in short, in the Old Testament, starting there is no law of adoption in the Old Testament law. That was not a practice that the Israelis had. They did not understand the concept or have the concept that you could take someone from one family, change their name and identity, and put them into another family. Secondly, if you look at the major adoption stories in the Old Testament, anyone think of the most important one? Moses, right. Is that a pro-adoption or an anti-adoption story? Have you read it lately? Okay. Moses in Hebrews is praised as an act of faith for rejecting his adoptive identity. Okay, read the story. So essentially, his whole ministry is also based on reconnecting with his mouthpiece, his birth brother Aaron, and his birth sister Miriam. Okay. So it is a reverse adoption story. It's based on him rejecting his adoptive identity and going back to the people of God. There is a more pro-adoption story in the Old Testament. Anyone think of it? Esther. Okay, but she is adopted essentially by her cousin or uncle, depending on your translation. So it's an intra-family, take care of your young family member when both parents are dead situation. And the text doesn't use the word adoption, actually, in terms of the Hebrew text. So we really have a problem with adoption in the Old Testament. When it comes to the term orphans, the better translation in the Old Testament is usually fatherless. That's what the King James does. I'm not a huge King James fan. I'm not saying you have to only read the King James Bible. I'm just saying that in this instance, fatherless picks up the fact that the Old Testament actually treats the orphan and the widow as a unit, which is what the book of James picks up on in that famous passage about, that's cited over and over again appropriately by the Christian orphan care movement, about visiting the orphan and the widow in their distress. If you go back over, don't have time to quote all the passages, the Old Testament passages, they're not two separate categories, folks, where we save the orphan and leave the widow to kind of die of hunger or whatever. In fact, all of the passages involve keeping them together when they're a vulnerable unit because they lack, in a very patriarchal setting, a man to protect them. And in fact, if you go through the rest of the Old Testament, you look at the Elijah stories, you look at, in fact, the Jesus stories, there is not a single positive story in the Old Testament or the New where you take a child away from a widow and give them to somebody else. But there are a number of positive stories where you resurrect the orphan for the widow, or where you provide sustenance for the orphan and widow together, ministering to them together because they're a vulnerable unit. I'm not saying there's no occasion in life where we don't have to take care of the orphan without the mother. We do, but that's not what the Bible portrays. And I think there's a lot of reasons for that, which we'll maybe get to. When you get to the New Testament, again, the word orphan is really only used twice. Two different Greek words. I'm not a Greek scholar, maybe you are. One, again, is that famous James passage to visit the orphan and the widow in their distress. And again, James tends to repeat the Old Testament wisdom, and that's what he's doing there. They're a unit to help. And then there's Jesus saying he will not leave us as orphans. I think a different Greek word. Those are the only two references in the New Testament. As to adoption in the New Testament, there's 5 uses by the Apostle Paul. 4 of them relate to the relationship of Christians to God, and 1 of them of the Old Testament people of God to God. There's no particular practice recommended or portrayed in the New Testament of adopting children. There's a lot in the New Testament about widow care, advice from Paul, and so forth. Again, there are probably a lot of reasons for that, but that's what's literally in the Bible. A word on the Pauline passages, because I'm going to suggest that the earlier form of the Christian adoption movement about 10 years back tended to misinterpret that. I think there's been some learning over that. The kind of earlier reading of that was that we could go from our relationship to God to the relationship of the adoptive parent to the adoptive child as some kind of analogy. You all know what I'm talking about? We're all adopted. You all ever hear that in church? And there's some problematics with that. Essentially, first of all, it's helpful to understand that when Paul refers to adoption, he seems to be referring to the Roman practice of adoption. Most of the references are in the book of Romans, and they're otherwise addressed to Gentile Christians. And the Roman practice of adoption at that time was the practice of adult adoption of either emperors or rich, wealthy Roman men adopting a young man to be the heir and maybe the next emperor. And so Paul's basic message in those passages is that you think it's a great honor to be the next emperor and to be adopted by the emperor for that, but it's a greater honor to be a child of God. And I think that's a great message, and I think that's true. But it's not particularly connected to orphan care. And that's the important thing. And it needs to be seen in the context that God is our creator. You know the basic sequence of salvation: creation, fall, redemption, and then sometimes there's a fourth one depending on how you do it. So we begin as related to God. In fact, a better analogy in the sense to the picture of our relationship to God would be restoring a child taken away from their family to their original family than giving them to somebody entirely new. Again, sometimes that parallel fits. If you're adopted as a teenager, step-parent adoption or older child adoption, then maybe the analogy fits. But typical orphan care adoption doesn't fit that analogy that well. Anyway, got to give you a chance.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
absolutely. Thank you. And I'll say, first of all, I would be remiss if I didn't say this. I am indebted to you for evolving in some of these thoughts and in position. And I know that publicly and even in writing, you and I have always not agreed. But I'm much in your debt, and am glad to know you. And I think that I told David, even as we started, that if you're expecting fireworks today, that's probably not going to happen, because
I started to introduce him as "and in this corner."
Yeah.
And I thought maybe
because fundamentally we agree about so much more than we disagree about. There are some things that I think as we and Dr. Smolin did an amazing job of unpacking the contours of the biblical text and our response to it. I am not a Hebrew scholar, but I am a guy that passed Hebrew in seminary, and so so that at least puts me on par with some of y'all. I think that one of the things that I think we can't miss in looking at the text, and one of the places that we differ, is in the understanding of orphan and widow and the boxcarring of those realities. Part of the reason that I take a little bit of a different approach to that is realizing that there is usually a third member of the triad. Very often, orphans and widows in the Old Testament are being mentioned along with sojourners. And there's a direct linkage in passages such as Deuteronomy 10, passages in Leviticus, that there's a sense in which that God is calling His people to care for orphans as a reflection of who He is, as a response to who they are. And so the idea is that God is a redeemer, and that Israel is being called out to reflect and even to foreshadow the gospel, I believe, in pointing to a future condition where God will redeem, where God will rescue, and where God will restore through His work. And so Israel is being called into a temporal work and into a condition where they're to be a witness to the other nations of the world. And by their care for the fatherless in the way that God has prescribed for them to do, because they are people who were once not a people, but have been gathered together and have become a people, or they have been made a people because God caused them. God chose Abraham. God brought a people, but over and over we hear thematically that sense of you were once not a people, but now you are a people. And so with those three linked together, I think that the commonality between widows, sojourners, and orphans is their voicelessness and their vulnerability. And so there's a sense that these are all groups within the context of the period that had no rights, they had no standing, they had no ability to be able to affect their own condition. They were completely without voice and without merit. But yet, God is calling His people to esteem them, to honor them, to care for them, and so I would project forward to say that's the beginning of a gospel issue. That's God foreshadowing through the way that He's calling upon His people to care for those who don't have a voice, who can't care for themselves, to care for them as in the way that He had cared for Israel, but more the way that He was going to care for them. If you want to, kind of put a colloquialism, this was the Mighty Casey moment. This was pointing over the fence and saying, this is the shot that I'm about to hit. And the shot that I'm about to hit is that Jesus is coming and that He's going to do in fullness what you're portraying before the world. I think so. I want to. I just want to be clear that I think we have to. And I am I would be. I think as we look at the scriptural text, a strict constructionist. So I would be someone who would not want to take liberties with the text at all. But I do think that you have to look, as we're looking at applying it into this context, into our modern context and into the world that we live in, that we have to realize that while the Bible is speaking directly, and while the Old Testament narrative is about children, most of whom are not double orphans, most of whom are single orphans who have mothers that are still living, that there is a general overriding ethic that says, as God's people, we are to care for them, and we're to care for them as a picture of the care that God has given us. Now, I think the great error that we risk is that we sometimes then bring adoption to bear in that conversation, and maybe have brought it to bear in all conversations. And so you've rightly said and rightly pointed out that those are not conversations that are inextricably linked. Biblically, I don't think they're inextricably linked practically either. Well, I'm sure we'll get into that and talk about that. The thing that I do want to enlarge and we'll go there, I'm sure, before our time is done, is the idea that we still have to keep the overriding ethic of why God was calling His people to care for orphans, and so therefore why we're called to care for orphans. And I don't believe that we can completely set adoption aside, because there are things we know now. There are things that we know about institutional environments and their inability to prepare children well, and the results. I know that from the children that are in my home, that are part of my family, that are mine. And so while we don't want to for a minute say that there is a biblical call to adopt, neither do we want to use the Bible to disregard the idea that adoption is an appropriate way to care for children in a way that God has designed through the Scriptures. That family is something that was created for our good, for our nurture, and we know the hurt and the result of a lack of attachment and a lack of proper nurture and what that has on children. And so while we want to delve directly into the passages that are obviously relevant because orphans are spoken of, and while we definitely want to acknowledge that adoption in the sense of the way that it's presented in the New Testament is really about our relationship to God, we also don't want to discount in a multiplicity of ways that the church can step in and can do orphan care in a modern context, that adoption automatically goes off of the table because there's some kind of overall biblical case to be made that adoption is not proper. I'll just say parenthetically, and this sort of gets out of the text, but I can tell you, I think we have overreached in the Christian community, and much of the guilt of this can be pointed directly to the Christian adoption and orphan care movement, particularly in the early days of that, to do a kind of an equivocation between spiritual adoption and earthly adoption, and to like look at that as the primary way that we're to care for orphans, and that's reckless. It's hazardous. It's not true. And I'll be honest with you that I've had to repent of that sin personally, of being too simplistic in the way that we've looked. But I don't think that invalidates. And I do want to say in the way that we then proffer the gospel, that Christian adoption done properly in right context, done ethically, gives us the opportunity to be able to give voice to the gospel. It's not the reason to adopt, but it certainly, we can never tell the story of our family and how our family came to be, that there's not an open door for us to then be able to speak of the gospel. I'll also testify to you that I've learned probably, like through the process of adoption, I've probably learned as much about God through the process of staring into the face of how much I'm not like God. And how much I'm not reflective of God as an adoptive parent, and so part of that journey of kind of reality is an experiential journey to say that there's so many things that we can say about God as an adoptive parent that thank God that we don't have to have said about us, and that's what grace and that's what redemption is about. One last thing, and I think the last thing is I will say that I do believe that in all things in orphan care, but in adoption, that fourth thing when we talk about creation, fall, redemption, and then that restoration component that we talk about theologically, that restoration, that many times when we see families come together in spite of brokenness through adoption, that there is an ability to put a taste on the lips of people of a coming reality and a coming kingdom where there will be no orphans, where there will be no widows, where Christ will reign, and that is an important theological component not to ignore.
Okay, before we move to question 2, Dr. Smolin, do you have anything to add to that?
Well, that was a beautiful statement. I mean, I agree with 95% of it. I mean, I'm not really.
I told you this wasn't going to be really exciting in the tussle.
I really appreciate it. Takes a big person to publicly say we were a little bit off. And again, my critique was never meant to say that we should never adopt children. Right. It was meant as a corrective to the adoption, as that this is the hammer for every nail, that this is the solution for everyone. It was also meant that if you do adopt, you need to be very careful, and you also talked about that beautifully. Right. That analogy too much turns into, or it did again, when it was wrongly understood, that the place that the adopted child's original family was something akin to darkness and Satan, and the country they came from was the land of darkness, and we brought them into America, the land of redemption, and it went to a lot of places we really don't want to go to, and just sort of naturally. And so again, the other piece of that, which I'm also an adoptive parent, but have had a somewhat different experience than some, being a much older child adoption and adopting children that were improperly taken, is that when you're an adoptive parent, I think sooner or later, in my case right away, in other cases with adopting young children later, you are going to meet the reality of the link between this child and their original family, and that can be an aspect of restoration. Yeah. So that's been the lived experience of people over time. Mm-hmm. So again, it's not that analogy. Obviously, when you go to God, you want to leave Satan totally behind. You don't want to have a continuing relationship, right? You don't want to go back and explore that link, right? But with adoption, it's in the natural course that the adopted child, whether they know that link or not, that's part of who they are, and that's going to be true throughout their life. So again, it's all the ways that even if you do adoption, which I agree entirely, we do not want to take off the table, we have to rethink what that means for our relationships.
Totally.
Yeah.
Okay, next question. Why are international adoptions to the U.S. Down by more than 75%? It's down from a high of 22,989 in 2004 to 5,372 in 2016. Why is that?
May I?
Yes.
And I will sure leave you plenty of room, I'm sure. I think there are multiple reasons. One of them is, I think, a greater concerted effort on the part of the world community to see children adopted, that adoption is the best option for those children. The Hague Convention, and something that Dr. Smolin is deeply invested in helping to work out and helping to interpret, has changed things. One of the things I think as Christians we have to acknowledge is that there is by virtue of people having to work in order for adoption to be done, there is an economy that is part of adoption in our context. There's commerce that goes on, and when there is commerce and there is vulnerability, you're going to find evil. People with bad agendas are going to rush to those places, and they're going to try to walk out their agenda, and for the very reason, go back to our last answer, for the very reason that these are voiceless, statusless, or ignored peoples, they are by nature easily victimized and a wide open target. And I'll say that in the body of Christ, we have a greater responsibility toward ethics. We have a greater responsibility to work in those circumstances in a way that not only is honoring of those children and in their being created in the image of God, but it's honoring to God Himself in how we work that out. Now, we may differ in the finer points of how that happens, but the truth is that part of the reason adoptions are down is not, there's not one answer. One is, yes, has been some regulatory activity and things that have stopped adoptions that shouldn't happen. There also has been regulatory activity at times that maybe has, I'm not going to say bordered on, at times it's onerous. And that there are children that I think maybe should be adopted that are not able to be adopted because of bureaucracy. And I sort of liken this to the way that I feel about the EPA. Like nobody wants dirty air. But the question is in regulating for dirty air, where's the line? Where's the limit? Where's the place where we find enough protection? And sometimes I think, especially on the world stage, we've tended to go overboard in some areas, or tended to be unspecific in ways that aren't helpful. And particularly as that relates to activity between countries. I think the other thing that we're beginning to see is that there's much more activity both within the church and outside the church with family preservation and family restoration, and we're seeing that in our own country in the foster care system, and the fact that we're waking up in large part to understand that our responsibility as Christians in the foster care system is about trying to bring the gospel to bear to birth families and trying to see birth families reunified, and that adoption is way down the list of actions. But in other countries as well, we see the results of economic development in countries that are children are not vulnerable. They're not as vulnerable. There's more opportunity for families, and so those children are not available for adoption. Rightly, that ought to be our goal. And part of it is just, quite honestly, that the children that are available for adoption it's hard. They're older children. They're children with special needs. They're children with large sibling groups and complexities in their circumstances. And as a dad who adopted a daughter at 14, as a dad who adopted a son at 7, after years of institutionalization and stories that have more twists and turns than we could take time to talk through. There is a right counting the cost, and even within the body of Christ, I think people coming to the realization that adoption maybe is not the right answer for our family. There is some other way we can be involved in orphan care, and so the numbers are down, and that in and of itself is not the alarming part to me. I think the magnitude of the level that the numbers are down is alarming to me, and it's kind of alarming on two fronts. One is making sure in the way that we walk out adoption and in the regulatory process that we haven't become onerous and have not become excessive. I think the other part is really the challenge to the body of Christ is children who are not well placed in their country. Like, we have to begin to step up our game a little bit to say, and at least to expose, and at least to ask the question of families: Is God maybe calling your family to adopt? But then we have to equally be ready to to marshal all the resources that are necessary. We have to have churches that are ready to wrap around those families when they're going to be hard and when they're going to have many needs for the rest of their lives. And we have to marshal the training and the things that are necessary in order to equip those families. And we have to provide counseling resources. And I could go on and on and on. And so I'm going to stop. But I think it's not simple math. It was 20,000 plus kids a decade and a half ago, and it was 5,600 kids this year. And wow, something's wrong. It's part of it's because there's some things that are right, and there's some things that are wrong.
Okay, first of all, just want to clarify my relationship with Lifeline, okay, if I could, because again, this was posed as an oppositional thing. I mean, I'm really very personally grateful to...
It wasn't intentional. That
and, basically, 10 years ago, whatever, back in 04, 05, 06, 07, 08, I really kind of launched into a critique of the Christian adoption movement. Mm-hmm. And, that's where Rick and I is kind of referring to some oppositional stuff. And in that context, I'm very personally grateful, particularly to Herbie Newell, the head of Lifeline, who really helped legitimize my voice in that and took a lot of courage and integrity for Herbie to do that. I don't want Herbie to be responsible for everything I say. He needs to be able to raise funds and support it. But I think what Herbie tried to do, particularly with the fundraising, is to position Lifeline as an organization where it was not financially dependent on doing a lot of domestic adoptions, a lot of international adoptions. You do a significant number, but as I understand it, for example, the numbers I've heard on the domestic side, you might counsel 500 women and maybe 20, 25 place for domestic adoption. And so you're not in a situation on the domestic side of pressuring women into adopting, which I've seen with so many lawyers and agencies. And again, it's the fundraising, it's the ability to situate yourself as an organization in ministering to the woman as well as the child. In the same way with international adoption, it's a very, very tough step for intercountry adoption organizations to become World Vision or become Compassion International, because they're not really set up to do that work. But at least I think Herbie has tried to, again, make the organization not dependent on keeping up the numbers. And again, so I deeply respect the work of Lifeline. It's messy out there. Yeah, Lifeline's made mistakes. They've had tough cases, but I'm not a critic of them for that, because they have been willing to correct and to make hard choices, So again, just out of a deep respect I have for them. But that hasn't always been the case. That hasn't always been the case in the Christian adoption movement. That hasn't always been the case for secular agencies. Again, in many a case, I'm very pro-life. I've worked in the pro-life movement. I continue to, but it's almost like many adoption agencies, many lawyers put themselves in the position that they only got paid when an adoption got done. Mm-hmm. And putting themselves in that position, they were not really neutral, and they were not in a position to be neutral. And a lot of intercountry adoption agencies have been whining a lot about regulations and the numbers being down, because they've got to go out of business when that happens. Mm-hmm. And my response to that is tough. You have the wrong business model. If this is supposed to be helping people. And frankly, a lot of them made far too much, again, not poking at Lifeline, but the nonprofit label can hide people making huge amounts of money, and we've seen that. There was the Lauren Galindo case, the agency, not a Christian agency, that was shut down, where it was estimated they had pocketed $8 million out of Cambodian adoptions over 4 years, from 97 to 2001. So there was that profiteering under the label of that. So the other thing I'd like to say to the Christian community generally is that there was a tendency to presume that, quote, the world, quote, didn't know anything about this issue. A little bit of arrogance in that respect. And again, I'm trying to come in and say, well, we got the Bible wrong. That's pretty important. But essentially, apart from that, I think what I want to say is, there were these entities. The Hague Conference on Private International Law, that I'm an independent expert, created the main treaty on international adoptions called the Hague Adoption Convention. Before that, there's another treaty called the Convention on the Rights of the Child. When you go to approach alternative care next week or whenever you're having that event, there's something called the UN Guidelines for the Alternative Care of Children. From my point of view, these are not perfect documents. They're not the Bible, but I think they actually are pretty good documents because they come out of a wealth of experience of working with children and families all over the world. And so while they're not perfect, there was a tendency to go in there and say, oh, UNICEF is horrible, they're a bunch of pagans. I don't know what but I kind of hear that, you know, or they're anti-adoption, or they're this, or they're that. And frankly, we kind of came off as the ugly Americans. I mean, I work a lot with European-based human rights organizations, and they basically see Americans willing to go to other countries, toss around a lot of money with this kind of naivety. Some of them actually making a lot of money off of it. Others who are idealistic, thinking, you know, we can just toss these, you know, people in India and Cambodia and Nepal and Guatemala, you know, these huge amounts for their economy of money in a context where there's a huge amount of corruption and document fraud, and they don't really have the governmental capacity to deal with our money without it corrupting the process. And so we've been kind of the ugly American Christian and the ugly American.
Okay, this leads us into the next question. We're already actually answering it, so might as well go ahead and ask
Okay.
it. Number 3, what has the American Christian community gotten right about international adoption, and what have they gotten wrong?
So I'll kind of finish that answer. I'll go to what we've gotten right is, we've got to be out there. I mean, it is the call of the church, has always been the call of the church to care for the vulnerable. And whether you deal with the Old Testament categories or not, children are often vulnerable, poor families are often vulnerable. So yes, we should be out there doing something. That's our call. And it's messy. But, and so I think that call certainly predates, is way broader than the evangelical movement, way broader than the last 10 or 15 years, way broader than American Christianity. But yes, we want to be part of that. That's part of the gospel. That's part of living the, you know, gospel. I think I've already said what we got wrong. We got wrong, you know, the biblical understanding of adoption. We got wrong what can go wrong. Because here's the part where we contributed to the downturn. When you go into a country with too much money, there's a cycle. Things blow up. Happened in Cambodia, okay? Happened in Andhra Pradesh, India, happened in Nepal, happened in Guatemala, where we go in, and often Americans were the biggest part of that, and there's a scandal. It blows up. One thing you can watch, there was a CNN story about Ugandan adoptions recently, kids for sale, involving a devout Christian family adopted a little girl, Namada, from Uganda, and you know they actually sent her back to her family because she was basically stolen from her family. You know, it just came out a few weeks ago. I actually worked with that adoptive family, you know, trying to help them decide what to do. They've got this child who it turns out, like, you know, is only, you know, wants to go back to mom back in Uganda, and they made that happen without any help from really the governments involved. Uganda helped a lot, you know. The State Department didn't get in the way here, but you know, you've got to realize when like stuff like that happens, countries shut down, and we helped cause that. Now I agree with Rick that some of it is actually applying these international standards and saying we're only going to use adoption when it's needed. I 100% agree with you as that. And then some of it is that, as you see when you go to the, you know, children waiting page of Lifeline, is that, you know, the kids who are legitimately eligible for adoption usually are not healthy babies.
Right.
And so you're really in, I mean, medical special needs, lifelong special needs, as well as the much older children who come, as Rick expressed it so well, out of those places of poor quality institutional care or trauma, and they're much older and they're not going to be easy to parent. And those are really mostly the kids, just like those are mostly the kids out of our foster care system that need it. And we don't want to be naive about who can adopt them, because the average family is not that good at parenting these kind of kids. You can be a great parent of a child, even a, you know, adopted or born to you baby, and it's a totally different kind of parenting. I don't know if you would agree with that.
Yeah,
Rick.
absolutely.
Yeah,
100%.
and so it's and I was naive and stupid. I mean, my whole capacity
Weren't
to
we
come,
all?
to come to the like, you know, movement is I didn't make my mistakes in public.
Yeah, right.
I made my mistakes in private.
Right.
That's the only difference between us.
Well, and I think, David, thank you, because I want to be clear even about what I'm saying about regulation and owners' regulations and things. Like on the whole, the regulatory posture around international adoption, particularly, but even in things that we're doing currently domestically, the regulatory posture is correct. I mean, I'm on record. I mean, my last book, I wrote extensively about Hague and so in the, like, I believe in that. I think sometimes the devil's in the details. And it's in the ways that countries walk those policies out or walk those treaties out. And part of so the question is what's the Christian adoption community or what's the Christian community getting right and what are we getting wrong? I think we're getting a lot of things, and if I can use my South Alabama birthright for a moment, we're getting a lot of things righter. I think we're not where we want to be, but I think there's a growing awareness. I mean, things like preparing families, things like doing training and education and equipping of churches and people to surround adoptive families for kids that fall into these categories that we've talked about that are rightly the children that should be adopted. I think or can be adopted. I think there's I think our voice has been heard more, but I think it needs to be heard more. We're getting it righter about supporting good regulation, supporting good policy, supporting good law. I think the other thing we've got to be educated enough, and we have to be fully prepared and fully equipped. We need to have our voices heard in the public square on both sides of that issue. And so I think Department of State has responsibility, is the central authority in the U.S. for the Hague Treaty. I think as believers we need to pay attention to how the policies are being made and how things are being enforced, and that we insist that as participants in our own governance that we're comfortable based upon our ethics, based upon what we know that we should do in protecting the vulnerability of children, but that ought to be an active conversation in churches, and the truth is it's not. And we're not calling our congressmen, and we're not talking to our senators and all. And part of the reason we're doing it is because, one, we don't know that we're supposed to do it. Two, is we're not informed enough on the issues, and that we're doing that. And so I think that some of that is on us, some of us that are at the place where we can speak into those things, for the body of Christ. But what have we gotten right, and what are we getting right? I think it goes back to the the discussion about the numbers on adoption, that the children, by and large today, that are being placed for adoption are children who the best opportunity for them is to be adopted into a family with the resources that are necessary, bringing those to bear.
Okay, we have a question here.
So for the situations that are not adoption appropriate, what are ways the church here can be helping those families of single orphans to help with resources there? Is there something that the church can actively be doing here so that the vulnerable are being taken care of,
Absolutely.
without being stripped of their
Let me go ahead and just repeat that because this is being recorded. She's asking, what can the church do to support the families of the vulnerable children in other countries? And I'll also add before they answer that that's a lot of what we're going to talk about next week as well. Go ahead.
Yeah, but I think that the question is, and probably most rightly framed is how are we partnering with and pouring into indigenous churches among the nations to see orphan care and to see family care done well in their own community, and so I mean, David's right that we have a really sullied reputation in a lot of places, most places probably, at being the people who come in and perform fairly paternalistically and throw money around and really don't have a sense of what's best. And so valuing local vision, valuing local solutions, finding the places where we can come alongside and empower local vision. And I believe that as believers that is most rightly done through the body of Christ. That's not to say that we don't ever partner with secular organizations. It's not to say that we don't have partnerships outside of that, but the place where we share the most agenda is within the church among the nations. And so helping churches to provide one of our unadopted projects in Uganda, for instance, there's a sewing center that's been started. It's not for children. The sewing center is for mothers of children who are able to learn a trade and to begin to make a living for themselves, so that their single orphan children don't become double orphan children. And those are the kinds of things that I think we need to think about entrepreneurially, about how do we come alongside and to partner to see those things happen.
We'll just take another question. I think.
Yeah, I have a question, because I feel like there's a little bit of assumed knowledge here. And so I want to ask, can you give me, as succinctly as possible, given the time, we have about till 5 after, 1 or 2 brief stories about where it got so wrong, where a church or an adoption agency got it really wrong in the sense of an adoption.
I'm going to defer to my brother.
Okay.
Right.
Okay, I have so many. I mean, it's just like...
That's why I really prefaced this. All right.
So, okay, I will just elaborate the story of European Adoption Consultants, EAC, which is currently, or I think IAG is another one. And some of the bad cases, I'm going to skip my own story, but some of the more recent ones. And I'd like to highlight more recent ones, because if I do my own, that's a long time ago, and people say it's been fixed. Okay, so basically, there's European Adoption Consultants has a Uganda program, and they link up with a particular orphanage in Uganda that turns out to be very corrupt. And so what that means is that essentially the orphanage goes around to the poor families or poor, vulnerable single mothers in rural villages who aren't particularly well educated or well situated or well connected, and basically offers them something for their child that is different from intercountry adoption. And maybe they offer them care in that facility that will be education that they can't provide, or food that they can't provide, and maybe they even offer them they're coming to America, but they think it's like boarding school, okay? And that's what happened there, okay? And basically, though, the woman, who probably can't read the paperwork anyway, or puts her signature, thumbprint, or whatever on it, and then basically little Namada then goes to the orphanage for the first time after the thing is arranged, actually, but the paperwork says she's been an orphan, And then again, I kind of use this one because just Google kids for sale, CNN. Jessica Davis, okay? And you can read her own statements about it, and I did, counsel in the background of this case. So little Namada is very unusual. She's much more adaptable. As an older child, most older children have a difficult adjustment at best, and then they may have continuing issues, they may not. Namada adjusts beautifully, but as she learns English, she basically tells her adoptive mother, I have a family back in Uganda, and they were able to take care of me, and they did want me. And I had this whole village of people who cared for me, because one of the things as well, we talk about single orphans, double orphans, but in an African context, the extended family and the village is huge. And so, somebody's not an orphan in the sense we think of it necessarily, even if they were a double orphan, because there may be other ways. So basically, poor Jessica Davis, she and her husband have practically bankrupted themselves. He's a Methodist pastor, I think. And they're not wealthy. They have several birth children, and they wanted to do something good and positive, and they've taken the older child. They've done everything right they know to do, and all of a sudden they've got this little girl. And again, this was an easier case than most of this type, because little Namada was very clear. I mean, clear to me, a stranger, which doesn't mean anything, but clear to her mother that I want to go back to my mom. I don't care that I'm not going to have all these little devices and American conveniences. I mean, she's an extraordinary little girl, but I want to go back to mom. And so she contacts the State Department, and the current head of the State Department Office of Children's Issues, Trish Matthew, is a friend of mine. I was not in that position ever before, and I don't abuse that relationship at all. But basically, they didn't help out because they don't really have a mandate to do anything in a case like this. Unfortunately, something needs to be done about that, or maybe they need to rethink that. They did go after the adoption agency because, of course, the problem is you go to your adoption agency, instead of your adoption agency saying, "Oh, that's terrible," they just deny. EAC is still denying, and so you've got basically On the other side, you had an organization called Reunite Uganda, which is an organization of basically one devout Christian woman, Karen Riley, who's also a friend of mine, who basically goes around reuniting children, not just in inter-country adoption, but ones who are stuck in orphanages, who have been separated, and no one is doing the social work. Because it does take social work to reintegrate them in, to make sure it's safe, to do the follow-up. And she's been doing that work, and she's been trying to stop these illegal adoptions. So there was somebody on the other side to go check in with the mother, with the village, with the whole situation, and to shepherd that. But it had to be done really completely privately in a certain kind of way. Now, the Ugandan government was supportive in the end, but they literally went to court in Ohio. I remember I was terrified. The Ohio court said you had, I think it was a 6-month deadline to dissolve this adoption, a year deadline, and they're talking about putting her on the plane. And I'm like, in a better world, we could have made sure it's all going to work smoothly over there, but it's like all this pressure. State Department's not helping, they're left there. And you got to realize how tough. I mean, they loved this little girl, and she adjusted well, and she was bonded in with their family, but it was all wrong, and they did fix it. But European adoption consultants deny. So that kind of case, usually not with the happy ending, because I consider this a happy ending. I've seen many times.
And I think that's an important thing just to point out. We're not dealing in the world of fairy tales, and so happy ending is sometimes still really messy. I think one thing that I just would like to it's like one element in the strata that I don't think we've talked about, that I do think the body of Christ has to get involved in more meaningfully, is about adoption within context. So for instance, I think one of the things we've observed, and Mark and Karen Riley are friends as well, and obviously we have those open channels and a friendship with Trish, and I think there are a lot of forces, and people are coming at this differently. But one of the things in the church that I think we have to begin to do is that children that are not going to be reunified, and particularly in Africa, is we're still dealing with the residual of the AIDS crisis and several countries where civil war, and they're missing generations, quite honestly, in cases. And so while Africa has an incredibly rich tradition of familial care, and that is true in some cases it's not possible. There just isn't the family there, but there is tradition and prejudice, and so like adoption across totem, across bloodlines, sometimes is difficult, and part of what I think we need to be doing is encouraging our brothers and sisters and praying for them and working with them to help them understand how to set up a foster care system, to help them to understand how to do adoption across bloodlines. Well, I think one of the greatest victories that's happened in the last 5 or 6 years is that in Kenya has produced a legal system for Kenyans to adopt across bloodlines. And it was easier for someone not Kenyan to come in and adopt a Kenyan child than it was for a Kenyan to adopt a Kenyan child. And that part of the responsibility that we have, even as ministries like ours, is to pour into churches and to pour into those systems and help make those things possible. Take what we know about foster care here. Take what we know about proper domestic adoption, and help them to both to ethically figure that out, but also to build the systems that are necessary to do that.
Let me say one more thing. Since I mentioned Trish Matthew, I'm going to make a particular statement. I think that the Christian community needs to be very supportive of what the State Department's trying to do with intercountry adoption. Trish Matthew is the first director in that post who actually knows something about intercountry adoption. And I don't mean that in a like arrogant way. It's just that usually it's kind of a civil service posting, and you kind of go into that job for some number of years, and then once you catch on to adoption, you get rotated out. And so basically, essentially, she is an adoptive parent who deeply cares about her children. They're grown now, but and took on some tough kids. Yeah. She worked with an agency in Cambodia back in the 98 to 2001 period and learned about how it can go wrong. Mm-hmm. She ran an organization that tried to deal with the ethics of adoption. She's a brilliant lawyer. She's not anti-intercountry adoption. She's not anti-adoption, but because she knows how it can go wrong, she's trying to create regulations, and the Department of State is trying to create regulations that make a U.S. adoption agency accountable for what goes on in the other country. And think about it as you're an adoptive parent. Why do you hire an agency? I mean, you don't know who the good person in Uganda or India is to work with. You assume when you hire an American placement agency that they're going to connect with people who are going to do it right, because a lot of the key stuff of deciding adoptability and getting a child study form that's accurate so you know whether you can handle the needs of this child goes on in the other country. But the American agency needs to be accountable to link up with people who get that right, at least most of the time, rather than with people who are in it for the money. And so Trish is trying to create, and the State Department, again, not to personalize it so much, regs that do that. And frankly, she's getting hammered.
Yeah.
Getting absolutely hammered. And that needs to change.
Yeah.
And really the kind of Christian community needs to come in and say, okay, maybe these regs aren't perfect. Maybe they need worked with. Maybe these new rules aren't perfect. But in general, approving the direction instead of the whole weight of the adoption community being, okay, regulations are stopping intercountry adoptions, State Department evil.
I agree 100%. I was just going to say, Trish, in a recent conversation in Trish's office in Washington, she made the comment that what this has become is that stakeholders, adoption service providers, the State Department, it's as if we're two firemen standing on the sidewalk watching a burning building burn to the ground full of children, and we're fighting with each other about having a fist fight about what the best way to go in and rescue them is, and that we have to get over the fight on the sidewalk and figure out how to work together to accomplish the goal. And I believe it can be done, but part of what has to happen in that, I believe, is for the church to engage this on all fronts and to increasingly be part of the solution, including the policing of ourselves and the policing of our ethics and actions.
Okay, we are out of time. I will simply say this: one of the main points for current, future pastors here, there's a responsibility to make sure that people in your church who are interested in or pursuing intercountry adoption are aware of the issues. So thank you so much for coming. This has been great. You are dismissed.